Solitaire Rose Radio, Episode 43, Jack Kirby, 1979 to 1987. Before I begin the episode, I do want to read a letter I received. I don't get a lot of letters. I get a lot of notes. I get a lot of people saying nice things, but I don't get a lot of letters. And I got one from David Goodnature, and it says, Cory, I'm getting caught up on some of the podcasts I follow, and I just listened to Solitaire Rose Radio 36. When I was a kid, I saw Jack Kirby's art, and it didn't jibe with my aesthetic of what a comic book should look like. I was always a John Buscema kind of guy, and as I've grown older, and hopefully wiser, I've come to appreciate the gentleman that created the medium that I have loved so much as a kid and rediscovered about 4 years ago. Jack's work speaks to me now. The power and the energy he drew with, as well as his visions of gods and demigods and tales of the ascension of man to a higher level, are just wonderful. I have a run of the Fantastic Four and the Marvel Masterworks that has all of Jack's wonderful work, and it's just amazing. That special connection that he and Stan had at the time, and the sheer genius that came out of that collaboration is just, well, fantastic. Thanks for the effort you put into these podcasts. Thanks for pointing out things that I should look for when trying to follow the evolution of Jack's work. I appreciate the time you look into these things. Now, if the Fourth World and Commandy trades would get reprinted so they don't go for $1 jillion, I'd be a happy camper. Until I got this email, I did not know that the Fourth World books and the Commandy books were going for such high prices. And I wish DC would just keep them in print the way they do Sandman and Preacher and Y the Last Man, because I think that those works at the time weren't appreciated as much as they are now. And it was one of those things that Mark Evanier talks about. Jack knew that this work would last. He knew that it was permanent. He knew that this was a big deal. And if you're reading through the Fantastic Four, read those Thor issues too. Thor doesn't get as much of the hype because there was a period after the creation of Thor where it was just kind of a mediocre book and Jack wasn't involved in it. But when Jack came back, the adventure, the work with gods and their dealings with man, and it really, in many ways, inspired Stan to write kind of on a different level than he did on his other books. There's sequences that I could just remember completely in my head, and his Thor is just as rewarding as the Fantastic Four. And I'm also glad that I'm able to do this in a way that introduces Jack Kirby to people. Jack, I've talked about in previous podcasts where when I was a kid, when I first started getting into comics, Jack had come back to Marvel, and a lot of the people, my peers, and of course, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, didn't like Jack's work. Comic tastes had changed, like they do a lot. In the 70s, it was a very Neil Adams, John Buscema type of art that was big and fame and what the fans wanted. Just like in the 80s, it was George Perez and John Byrne. And in the 90s, it was Jim Lee. And then now it doesn't seem that there's sort of a template that people go to. People are doing more individual stuff. But even as a kid, Kirby's work just really jumped out at me. Matter of fact, the only one of the original Marvel artists that I didn't much care for at the time was Don Heck. I felt that Don Heck's work was dull and gray and flat. And it wasn't till later that I started to appreciate the realism that he put into his stuff, the casting that he did, the way he could make people in regular clothes seem interesting. He wasn't a superhero artist. He was a hell of a good horror artist. And his horror stuff in the 50s was so good. And when I read those old Iron Man, the action sequences aren't as fun, but the romance and the sort of Stan Lee inspired corporate stuff really, really works. So if there was an artist that you didn't much care for as a kid that you heard a lot about, go back and revisit the work now. The work hasn't changed, but you're coming to it in a different way. You're coming to it with different perspectives and more knowledge and maybe different expectations. When I left off, and it was sadly a good stopping point for the podcast, Jack's contract with Marvel ran out. He didn't renew it. There's very little talk of if he even tried to renew it. He was disgusted with comics. He was tired of comics. He felt he was treated poorly by DC, and that after he left, then they appreciated him. Marvel, he wasn't happy there either. He felt he was treated poorly by the editors. He felt that he had been lied to. He was unhappy having to come back. So when he left comics, there are a lot of people who talked to Jack at conventions and things during this time, and he would actually tell young artists when they'd come up for advice, don't work in comics. Don't work in comics. There was also a feeling among comic professionals that comic books were dying. Gold Key, which had been around since the 40s, and at one point was selling millions and millions of copies of Disney books, was closing up shop. They had limited distribution through Whitman, and in my memory, I only saw Whitman comics in the 3-bag sets at toy stores. I didn't see him at the grocery store. I didn't see him at the gas stations and the department stores and the Ben Franklin's and places like that that always used to sell them. Harvey had fallen rapidly in 75 when I was a kid, and that was the last when I was buying kid comics. Harvey was selling tons of books. By 78, 79, their output had dwindled. Archie was still doing okay because Archie knew how to work distributorships. They had a lot of power, and in a lot of ways, they were kind of the arm of the comics code. DC had suffered an implosion and was restructuring its publishing, going from a plan of 50 to 60 books a month to down to 20. Marvel had even contracted. In 1975, Marvel, if you look at the Marvel subscription page, was frightening. You look at the Marvel subscription page in 1978, there were very few books on it. They didn't have everything they published on it because they didn't want to sell subscriptions to books they'd probably have to cancel. A lot of creators talked about how they were just wrapping up their work, wanting to go to another field. Jack Kirby, through his connections and the people he'd worked with and the people he knew, went to animation studios. He went to Hanna-Barbera, and Hanna-Barbera was very happy to get him. They had him work on character design. They had him work on storyboards. They really were happy to see him there. But it was the animators that really, they'd come by where Jack was working and want to talk to him, want to ask him about the stuff he'd done. They'd want to ask him for ideas on things. And Jack really felt appreciated. He also got really good pay, which is sad to think of because at the time animation didn't pay that well. Disney was on fumes. People didn't think Disney would last too long. They hadn't had a big hit in a while. Hanna-Barbera, cutting costs. Filmation was terrible. Filmation. Oh, you look at those Filmation shows around that time. DePatsy and Freeling was sputtering along, making money off the Pink Panther and a few other things. But Jack was getting paid better in animation than he did in comics. He also had medical coverage for the first time in a long time through his job. And he felt respected. There was another thing that happened during this time, and that was there was a movie that they were going to make, an adaptation of Roger Zelazny's book, The Lords of Light. And they weren't just going to make a movie, they were also going to make an amusement park, because they felt that this story was big enough that it would be huge like Star Wars. And they had a multimedia plan set in place, and there were investors, and there was all this work. And they asked Jack to do design work. And Jack was doing storyboards for Hanna-Barbera, so he knew what they were looking for. And he'd read the book, and he read over the information that they sent him, and he drew plans for an amazing amusement park that could never be put in place, but it still, the look was incredible. He designed characters, sets, all this work. Now, the financing fell through, but it was also around this time that over in Iran, the government that we had been supporting for years collapsed. And the government was not well liked by the people. You can read your own history books on it. I don't want to get into the political end of it. But what happened was that they wanted nothing to do with anything that had to do with America because they felt that we'd put a dictator in charge and we had trained their secret police. So they rushed the embassy and took hostages. Now, not everybody was in the embassy when it was rushed, but it was impossible for an American to get out of Iran. And there were a group of people that were outside the embassy, still able to communicate to the U.S., but there was no way for us to get them. Except there was a group that thought up a way to get these people out. And their plan was to have a movie. They would go under cover of being filmmakers. And in doing so, they would be able to get these people who were in hiding out and onto a plane before the Iranian government knew what was happening. Now, in order to do this, they needed Hollywood people, they needed sets, they needed designs, they needed storyboards. And they went to Jack Kirby, who had all this stuff. And he supplied it, and there were other people involved. And if you want to know what happened, go watch the movie Argo. Really great movie. It downplays Kirby a bit. But here's the thing. When they started talking about Argo, first it was a book, and then the movie. But when the book came out, it's this secret plot of how we got people out of Iran. And nobody has known this for years and years and years. And it was all very familiar to me, and I knew this story. And I knew the Kirby connection. And I had no idea how I knew it. I didn't know how. One of those things where you know something and you don't know why. And then when I read the book, I realized Jack Kirby told this story at the Chicago Comic Convention in 1985 about how he worked on a movie and then they took the stuff from the movie to get the hostages out. And if you remember back in the early episodes, 1985 is when I got to meet Jack Kirby. And I went to the panel and he told stories. And one of the stories was about Argo. So Jack worked in this field. He did storyboards for the Fantastic Four. He did character design for Thundarr the Barbarian, for Turbo Teen. He did tons and tons and tons of character sheets. Designing characters, creating characters, coming up with ideas. And a lot of them were just kind of filed away. If Hanna-Barbera didn't want them, he'd file them away to use them later. And after he did Argo, he kind of came up with an idea for a movie. And it's really unknown if he did storyboards or what, but he had an idea for a movie. And he had one of the ideas that he pitched to animation that hadn't taken off. And by 1981, he'd filed a lot of this stuff away. 1981 is kind of a significant year for Jack in that there was a fledgling comic book company. They were really a comic shop that had become a distributor. And the way the early distributors were, it's anybody could be a distributor if you ordered enough books. So there were a lot of comic shops that would order enough books to be a distributor. And if you look at the history of the direct market, and Phil Suling, who created the direct market, went to Marvel and DC and other publishers and said, look, I will buy the stuff direct. You don't have to ship it through distributors. I'll buy it direct, and I'll buy it unreturnable. In return, you sell it to me cheaper, and I get it when it's printed rather than, it having to go through the distributor and the sub-distributor and then the person who takes it out to the grocery stores. And one of those was Pacific Comics out in California. And Pacific Comics had caught in on this, and they were a small distributorship, but they had the bug to publish books. And believe it or not, they just asked Jack Kirby, hey, we would like to publish a comic of yours. Now, Jack knew little about the direct market. Most people didn't know much about the direct market at the time. But here's a new publisher, and what Jack said was, all right, here's what I want. And he made his list. And the people at Pacific Comics were like, we get to publish a Jack Kirby comic. Holy crap, we get to publish a Jack Kirby comic. So they signed up. They agreed to everything he had. They put together the deal. And what it was, Kirby would create the comic completely, and they would just print it and ship it. And Kirby would get royalties, and he had complete editorial control, and the only thing he asked him was, don't change anything. Don't change a word, don't change a line, don't change anything. I will create it, package it, give it to you, much like he did when he and Joe Simon had their publishing company. They would just put it together, print it. The Simon and Kirby studio had always done that. They'd put everything together and give it to the publisher, and the publisher would print it. So in Kirby, for a lot of ways, this was going back to the old days, where he would create the comic, give it to them. It's what he wanted at DC. It's what he wanted at Marvel. And Pacific gave it to him. And there were two books that they did. There was Captain Victory and the Galactic Rangers, which lasted 13 issues and an annual. And Silver Star, which Kirby said was an adaptation of the movie idea he had. Now, they've both been reprinted a couple of times. And I have to admit, they're not easy to read. Kirby's art had taken a stumble. Now, there are a whole bunch of theories as to why. Some was that he was getting older and his vision was bad. Some were that he was becoming more abstract as he aged. There is also a prevailing theory that Kirby had had a stroke, and the family hushed it up and kept it quiet. I've heard a number of times how Kirby was in a car accident, and the way Roz told the story was that Kirby was off in his own head creating stories, got distracted, crashed the car. Other people who know the family have said that no, Jack was driving, had a stroke while he was driving, but no matter what happened after that car accident, Jack never drove again. Either his wife Roz drove or someone else drove. Now, Kirby, doing an independent comic that he owned for the direct market, these were the early days of the direct market, the early issues of Captain Victory and the Galactic Rangers, sold over 150,000 copies. Silver Star sold as well, because it was, wow, this little bitty company had gotten the big name in comics. The problem was when the work came out, people weren't enamored of it. Didn't look like the Fantastic Four. Didn't even look like the New Gods. Kirby's scripting had become more of what I've termed word jazz. It seemed stilted. It seemed odd. He would put quotation marks around things for emphasis that we didn't quite get. I've tried reading them a few times, and I love Jack's work. Please don't get me wrong. I love Jack's work. This stuff was not very good. Another interesting thing that happened during this was, while Kirby gave them the package, he left it to Pacific to put together the letters pages. Until they had a letter that was critical of Kirby's work. Kirby called them up when he saw it, said, I don't want any knock letters. And at that point, Kirby gave instructions, only positive letters, etc., etc., etc. And the two publishers, hey, we've got Jack Kirby. Of course we're going to do what Jack Kirby wants. But Kirby was still stinging from what he felt at Marvel, where they would put negative letters in his books. Basically, Kirby believed that the reason they did it at the office was to take away the editorial control and have him work with a writer like he had with Stan, and he didn't want to do that anymore. He wanted nothing to do with a collaborative process. He wanted to do it all himself. Silver Star was a 6-issue miniseries. It finished, it wrapped up. Captain Victory lasted 13 issues and an annual. By the end, it wasn't selling that well. As I said, they've both been collected. They're for hardcore Kirby fans only. They really are. But another thing happened that really kind of... There were two things that happened that really gave Kirby what he felt was kind of a kick in the balls. And the first was that he had put together comic Battle for a Three-Dimensional World. He put together a 3D comic for Ray's Own, and there were 3D glasses, and on it was Jack Kirby, King of the Comics. Well, it was around that same time that TV stations figured out that they could show old school 3D movies. They could show the blue-red 3D, where the movie's in black and white, but they use blue and red in order to give it the illusion of 3D if you wear glasses, where one lens is blue and one lens is red. And that was kind of a big deal, and they had printed a ton of 3D glasses for the Kirby's Battle for a Three-Dimensional World. And Ray's Own, who was big into 3D, printed up the glasses when I seem to remember it was 7-Eleven had the glasses for California. Where I lived, it was Convenience, which was a convenience store, but it was just called Convenience. We didn't have 7-Eleven in Central Illinois. And we had the 3D movie, too. We didn't get the Kirby glasses, or I would have just been bouncing off the walls. Yeah, Kirby 3D glasses, oh my God! But the thing was, it was really hyped in Los Angeles, and Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show, was making jokes about it, and at one point somebody brought in the 3D glasses, and he put them on and made jokes and everything. Then he looked at him and he said, "Kirby, King of the Comics." Well, I know comics. I never heard of this guy. Have no idea who he is. And these glasses are flimsy and cheap and terrible. Kirby, more like King of the Con Men. And the problem was, that was during a time when everybody watched The Tonight Show. Everybody watched Johnny Carson. So here's Jack Kirby at first, excited that something he did is on The Tonight Show. And then Johnny Carson, in front of an audience of millions, calls you King of the Con Men. And he's devastated. He's heartbroken. And a good thing was that his friend and former assistant, Mark Evanier, knew people who worked on The Tonight Show, because Mark had written for a lot of comedians. He'd written for TV shows, he'd written for animation, but he'd written a lot of jokes for a lot of comedians. And he called up the people at The Tonight Show and explained what had happened. And the next night, Johnny Carson, he did the monologue, and then they have the bit at the table, at the desk. And before he went into the prepared bits he did at the desk, he said, "I have an apology to make. Yesterday, I showed these 3D glasses, and I made fun of Jack Kirby, saying that I'd never heard of him. Well, Jack Kirby isn't a stand-up comedian, which is why I've never heard of him. He's a comic book artist. And he's created the Fantastic Four and Captain America and Thor and all of these characters that people know. And I apologize for making fun of him, and I apologize for saying he's a con man. He's really a great artist and beloved by a lot of people." When I was in San Diego in 2001, Mark Evanier told the story and showed the clips, so he had them. But then Marvel shoved another knife in his back. And it was something that Kirby kind of was mad about till the day Jim Shooter was fired. The 20th anniversary of the Fantastic Four was coming up. And they wanted to do a big deal. And I remember John Byrne was drawing the Fantastic Four, and John Byrne was saying that he was the modern-day Jack Kirby. And because of his speed and because of this, but he would talk about in tons of interviews that he was the modern-day Jack Kirby. He was the heir to Jack Kirby. And Jack Kirby didn't much like that because he knew how John Byrne had talked about him at the office. Byrne was, in Kirby's mind, part of the group that mocked him, made fun of him, didn't treat him well, ran him down to other editors. And Kirby could hold a grudge. So as they're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the Fantastic Four, they also advertised a new story by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Jack didn't draw anything for that issue of the Fantastic Four. What they did, Marvel took the storyboards he did for the Marvel Animation Studios Fantastic Four TV show, and they had Stan treat it the way he treated a Kirby book. He scripted it. And they took Kirby's art and they altered it and they changed it from storyboards to panels, and Stan scripted it, and there's your brand new Fantastic Four story, which was an adaptation of Fantastic Four number 5, the one where Doctor Doom sends them all back in time and the Thing becomes Blackbeard the pirate. So a new story. They're advertising. Jack Kirby didn't get a penny. Jack Kirby didn't agree to his art being used for that, even though, let's be honest, if you work for a company, they're going to use your stuff however you want, but they didn't pay him for it. They didn't ask him about it. And he felt betrayed, and he felt used, and he felt like that they had treated him poorly and were still making money off of him. Now, it was around this time that Steve Gerber began a court fight for ownership of the character Howard the Duck. And the reason for that was, in Gerber's mind, he had created the character. He didn't believe that the work for hire contract covered it, but he was also using the Howard the Duck newspaper strip as his legal basis, because in newspaper strips, the contract, the work for hire didn't exist in comic strips. And the work for hire contract that Marvel used up until 1978 had been thrown out. It was no longer legal. So Gerber was suing for ownership of Howard the Duck. Now, Gerber was working in animation as well. He worked with Jack Kirby on Thundar the Barbarian. They knew each other. They got along. And Steve went to Jack and said, I need to do a fundraising book. I need to do something to start to pay my legal costs. And that's where the comic Destroyer Duck came from. It was supposed to be a one-issue, just to raise some money. It's the early days of the direct market, so it sold very well. And eventually, they did another issue. And they did another and another and another. Now, Gerber didn't write all of them, and Kirby kind of faded out on the art as well. But Steve Gerber and Jack Kirby doing a vicious, nasty attack parody on Marvel and work for hire and all that. I wish they'd reprint those, because those are some fun comics. You could tell Kirby was enjoying working with Gerber. You could tell Gerber was just in pure attack mode. And when Gerber's attacking, there's nobody more entertaining. But that was really about all Kirby did in comics. He wasn't as fast as he used to be. And he wasn't as good as he used to be. And he wasn't as connected as he used to be. Now, over at DC, they'd signed a toy contract. Much like Marvel had a toy contract with Mattel to do Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars, DC had a contract to do Superpowers with Kenner. And one of the things that had happened at DC was if you had created a character or significantly changed a character after a certain date, you could share in the royalties. You would get a payment for the character when they're used in toys and used in other media and used in posters. And Jeanette Kahn was still in charge of DC, and she remembered looking at the sales figures for the New Gods and seeing that the New Gods sold much better than people thought at the time. And again, the story is that everybody at DC was looking at the percentage of what was sold, and Jeanette Kahn looked at the numbers, and the numbers were as good or better than most DC books, which is why one of the first projects she did was Return of the New Gods. So, with that change in contracts, and Jeanette Kahn knowing that Kirby's work at DC had done well, DC was doing reprints of some of their stuff that didn't do as well on the newsstands, but probably would do very, very well in the direct market on Baxter paper, which was this nice, very stiff white paper. And they would reprint books in miniseries. So they went to Jack, and they put together a plan. They said, well, first off, we're going to reprint The New Gods, and we would like you to do an ending. We'd like you to finish the saga. And in that, we would like you to do some redesigns on the characters, because they're going to be toys, and they're going to be showing up on TV. And we'd really like you to share in the proceeds of that. Paul Levitz was really good at that. Paul Levitz was probably one of the best people to work for creators' rights in a corporate structure in comics up till that point. And Jack agreed. And what it was, they would reprint The New Gods with Jack doing an ending, and then they would do the Superpowers miniseries that Jack would work on, which would have the redesigned characters. And they advertised it everywhere. Any DC comic you bought, Superpowers or The New Gods. And as they were working on The New Gods, Kirby would recreate covers for the reprints as wraparound covers. And it would be covers that had been well loved, or scenes inside the books that had been loved. And this was where I finally was able to get my hands on The New Gods, because the back issues were prohibitively expensive for somebody who was basically working his way through college and trying to buy new books. But hey, they're going to reprint The New Gods. Finally, I get to read it. Now, the Superpower series was written for kids. And Kirby didn't do all of the art. There were other artists who worked on it. But The New Gods, as they're going through, the plan changed from Kirby doing a finale there to wanting to do something in their graphic novel line. Because Marvel had the graphic novels, and they were doing very well, and DC had not started. Now, these are not graphic novels like we think of, where they're trade paperbacks that are big and thick and so. No, these were more like the European albums. They were usually 48 to 56 pages, little larger size, paperback covers, really nice paper, even better than the Baxter paper. It was beautiful paper. It was like a large annual for like $4 or $5.95, which was kind of expensive when comics were 75 cents or $1 at the time. And as Kirby was working on the conclusion for The New Gods, the DC graphic novel line was not doing that well, and they decided, why don't we have Kirby's New Gods finale be in a DC graphic novel? Now, Kirby, the dimensions of a graphic novel are just a little different. It's a little wider and a little shorter than a regular comic book page. So Kirby was going to have to redesign the pages. He had Greg Theakston help, he had Mike Royer help, he had a number of people help with that. But the other thing that happened was Kirby talked about how, in his mind, Darkseid had the voice of Richard Nixon. When he envisioned the character, he thought of Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon had been out of office and out of the public eye for long enough that Kirby didn't feel that he could capture Darkseid's voice. The story wasn't coming together well. Kirby was unsatisfied with it. DC was unsatisfied with it. But they were reprinting The New Gods, and the wheels were turning. Dick Giordano flew out to Kirby's house and stayed with him and worked through the story with him to help Kirby kind of figure out what he wanted to do with the story. The other thing they did was the last issue of the reprint of The New Gods would only have one comic in it, so they figured we'll have a large new Kirby story in that last issue. That leads into the DC graphic novel, which was The Hunger Dogs. Now, Kirby and the people who work for him said that the ending in The Hunger Dogs was not what he had in mind when he did The New Gods. But as we've talked about, Kirby never quite knew where he was going. He was the type of writer, the type of creator who would just sit down at the page and explore. He wanted to see where it would go. So he probably didn't have a conclusion, or he had a bunch of conclusions. But when he did The Hunger Dogs, it was not the conclusion that anybody would have thought of. The other thing about The Hunger Dogs, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So we get to the new God story. And in it, a lot of things needed to happen, because in the New Gods comic, Desaad had been killed, Calabac had been killed, all these characters. So Kirby had to bring them back. In this, he had the redesign for the characters, for the toys and the cartoons and everything. He also had to have a story, and he had to set up what he was going to do in The Hunger Dogs. And when I go back and I read that story now, it was after I'd read Silver Star. It was after I'd read Captain Victory and been completely underwhelmed. And while Kirby's art still was lacking, it had the energy. It had the excitement. It had the big concepts. It had the new ideas. It had that epic feel. It was like a Wagnerian opera writ large across the sky. This was the New Gods. This was everything I had wanted leading in. And because I have read it that way first, it will always be like that in my mind. And then we get to The Hunger Dogs. And The Hunger Dogs had different panel placements than I was used to. Part of it was because Kirby had to literally cut the pages apart and reassemble them, but partly because Kirby wanted this to be different. He wanted it to be modern. He wanted it to be what he thought comics should be now. There's an undercurrent of darkness through The Hunger Dogs that hasn't been there in Kirby's other work. The young boy that had been Metron's companion in The New Gods had grown up. He was dark, he was evil, and he was bitter, and he was cynical. And there was a part of me that when I read it, I keep thinking, Kirby's optimism is going away. Kirby's optimism is gone. He no longer has that bright vision of mankind's future. As he's getting older, he's feeling, like many people do, that humanity's best days are behind them. Now, Kirby had to change the ending. He wanted to completely end the saga of the New Gods. But because DC wanted to use the characters more, they had him change the ending. And it works. It's a conclusion. It's not the most satisfying conclusion. It's not the conclusion I would have wanted. I would have wanted more pages. Kirby wanted more pages. Kirby wanted more. But that's what he had. And he was able to conclude the saga of the New Gods in The Hunger Dogs. 10 years after the book had been canceled, he was able to go back and give it an ending. Meanwhile, over at Marvel, because of all the changes with copyright and the changes with work for hire and the changes with other things, Marvel was giving artists their original art back. Now, when they started it, the original arrangement was that the penciler would get a number of pages, the inker would get a number of pages, and the writer would get pages, because they knew that selling the pages was how you could make money, and the writer wouldn't get any cut of it. Now, what do you think are the odds of the fact that the writers are the ones who came up with that idea? Many of the artists were unhappy about it. There's a story of P. Craig Russell coming into the office to pick up his art for a Doctor Strange annual, and being a little miffed that the writer of said annual got some of the pages. And the writer said, well, I contributed to this story too. And P. Craig Russell just took his X-Acto knife and popped off the word balloons, handed it to the writer, and said, there, that's what you contributed. Now at Marvel, there was a simple one-page release. Basically, you would say that you don't own copyright to the characters, that the artwork, blah blah blah, can be reprinted, etc., etc. Bunch of boring legal boilerplate, and you'd sign it and you'd get your art back. And they were giving back all the art that they could. Now, there are stories that a lot of the art from Marvel was stolen. There are other stories that the art was poorly kept. There's a number of people who say that it was in a warehouse and the warehouse had leaks and nobody ever checked on it. Just every couple months they'd drag all the artwork and put it in the warehouse on shelves. And if the ceiling leaked, well, it leaked, and we all know what paper and water don't get along all that well. But Jack, on the other hand, who, if you remember right, in 1968 it had gone to court to say that he had nothing to do with the creation of Captain America in order to get royalties from the work he did from Martin Goodman. After the court case, Martin Goodman kind of laughed at him, called him an idiot for believing him. You made a mistake, Jack. You trusted me. You'll know better next time. They sent Jack a 4-page release form, and in it, it was written in such a way, according to Jack and his lawyers, that Jack was not allowed to sell his original art. If Marvel wanted it, they could come and take it back at any time. He was signing away all future rights to everything. And he was the only person, the only one, who got this 4-page agreement. And Jack didn't keep silent about it. He explained to people that Marvel wasn't returning his original art until he signed this onerous 4-page legal agreement that no one else got. And there was a magazine called the Comics Journal, run by Gary Groth, who formed Fantagraphics, which now is best known for being one of the best publishers at reprinting old works in comic history. But at the time, the Comics Journal was basically known as a what's the best way to put it? Pain in the ass. They hated mainstream comics, and they really hated Marvel. And any chance they could to poke Marvel in the ass with a trident, they took. They would interview people as they left Marvel, basically goading them on to tell us all the dirt, tell us all the horrible things, tell us everything that's wrong. And especially at the beginning of Shooter's run at Marvel, if you left Marvel pissed off, Gary Groth was your best friend. Now, Groth talked about creators' rights. He has shown that he is a fierce advocate for creators' rights. I'm not going to say that Gary Groth did things just to stir the pot, but I'm not saying he didn't stir the pot sometimes. And they took up the banner of getting Jack Kirby his artwork back. And the people who lined up behind him were the people who you would think now, well, of course, these guys were big in creators' rights. Frank Miller, Dave Sim, Alan Moore, on down the line, signing petitions saying Marvel needs to give Jack his art back. At conventions, fans would go to Marvel panels and tell Jim Shooter, give Jack his artwork back. Now, knowing corporate structure the way I do, Jim Shooter, who was editor-in-chief of the publishing end, probably had nothing in the world to do with the legal end. He probably had nothing to do with the returning of people's artwork back, other than maybe in meetings with his supervisors he could advocate for it. And after he left Marvel, he said he did. But at that time, as the editor-in-chief of Marvel, as the public face of Marvel, as the head of Marvel's PR, no, he wasn't the head of Marvel's PR, but boy, if you look at what he did at the time, he really thought he was. He said that this is we need to do this, we need to protect the characters, we need to protect the company. He was a fierce advocate for Marvel's side. And boy, did this thing blow up in Marvel's face. Every convention they went to, there would be people there. Any panel that had some of the people who fought for creators' rights would talk about getting Jack Kirby his artwork back. Jack gave interviews, and what he wanted his artwork for was he wanted to make sure that he had money for his family. He wanted to pass down money for his family. A lot of the people who grew up in the Depression wanted to make sure that their family had a nest egg, that they would never have to go through that they would never have to worry the way they did in the 30s. And Jack's art on the original art market sold very well and for high prices. And Jack didn't get a cut of that because art would kind of sneak out of the Marvel offices. Art would kind of sneak out of the Marvel warehouse because nobody was paying attention to it. And Jack's work was selling at conventions. I saw it. You know, this was back when a George Perez page would be 30, 40, 50 bucks. Jack Kirby's art was selling for 200, 300, 400 bucks. And Jack wouldn't get a cut of that. Jack wouldn't get any of that. It's his art. He drew it. According to the new copyright laws, he was the one who got to own it and sell it. Marvel owned what was on the page, but Jack owned the page itself. And he fought, and his lawyers fought, and that fight continued until 1987, when they came to an agreement. Jack was given around 1,100 pages, far less than the over 20,000 he drew for Marvel during the 60s. He got 1,100 pages from that time. Now, there's one other story Jack Kirby did for a magazine that a lot of people didn't know about. I didn't know about it till much later. It was a magazine called Argosy. And Argosy was kind of, they were bringing back old magazines in the 80s. Amazing Stories, which was the first science fiction magazine, had gone away. Oh, it came back, and then there's a TV series. It was actually owned by TSR, the people who did Dungeons & Dragons. They'd bought up the name Amazing Stories, and then there's a TV series, so here's the magazine. Isaac Asimov started a science fiction magazine. Argosy brought back a magazine, and they published a story by Jack Kirby called Street Code. And Street Code was a story Jack wrote and drew about his childhood. And it's been reprinted by Tomorrows. And it's Jack drawing what it was like when he was a child. And it's a short story. And I've talked about how Jack's art in the 80s wasn't the best. But this story, for what he thought, you know, remember, Jack loved the pulps. He loved the magazines. He was a voracious reader. Argosy had a name. It had status. It was an important book. Jack put his heart and soul into that story, and it's called Street Code. And it's the story of his childhood, good and bad. One of the reasons he wrote a lot about kid gangs was because he'd been in one. He talked a little about his parents, but mostly he talked about what it was like living on the street, not having a lot of money, in the 20s. And I love The Hunger Dogs, and I love Jack Kirby's wrap-up of The New Gods. And I really like Destroyer Duck. But if you want to read a great Jack Kirby story from the 80s, go to Tomorrow's Publishing and buy the book Street Code. Because that was Jack's masterpiece during this time period. Jack finished up his work for Regular Comics by working on DC's Who's Who, which was, if Marvel did something, DC did something. And there are stories as to who did it first, but both of them put out a series of comics that were, here's our character, here's what they look like, and here's their history and their powers. Marvel did one, DC did one. And these were kind of their Bible for creators at that time period, for here's what you need to know about this character. Jack did the drawings for the characters he created, for the Guardian, for the Boy Commandos, for the Newsboy Legion, for all the New Gods characters. He did all of them for Who's Who. And they were beautiful because they were just Jack drawing the character so people knew what the costume looked like and everything. And that was Jack's last work for one of the mainstream publishers. And I find it
I find it kind of nice that after Jack felt he was used so poorly by DC and Marvel, that DC brought him back, made sure he got a cut of what he created, let him finish his story, and he sort of ended his career by drawing some of the characters that he'd created. It was in 1987 that Jack finished that work. He got his artwork back from Marvel. And in a lot of ways, that was the close of Jack's career. He did a few other things here and there. He had some ideas that he'd worked on, but he never really did another comic to sit down and draw a comic. Jack was retired. He came to conventions, and in the 90s, there was other work. But that's a story for the next podcast. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for downloading. And I really would like to ask that you let people know about this podcast. I'm doing a lot of different things. I'm doing this Kirby history, which as I think about it, as I was mixing the last one, I realized I'm doing a Kirby biography in audio form. And I think when it's all done, I may actually put it up as a separate download. So, hey, you want the story of Jack Kirby? You want Kirby's life story? Here you go. Here's the Solitaire Rose history of Jack Kirby. I also like your suggestions. I did an instant podcast earlier this week. I'm going to be doing more of those because I like that idea. I like being able to just flip on a switch, record a podcast, put the music in and put it up and not worry about mixing and ads and all that. But we do have ads, and the reason we have ads is so that we could pay for the cost of the podcast. I could get a little extra spending money. And because, let's face it, if I sell enough ads and I do well enough, I can do this full time and not have to have two jobs. So here's our ads. This podcast and all the other podcasts that we have on the Solitaire Rose Network has sponsors, and our sponsors are, first, as always, our beloved DreamHost.com. DreamHost.com is the best web host in the whole known universe. You need a website. Come on, you know you need a website. If you're going to set up a store, if you're going to start writing, if you're going to start drawing, if you're going to start creating, if you're going to start selling, you need a website. So go to DreamHost.com, use the code CRAZY, and get $20 off your first year. We have a new sponsor. That sponsor is Flaviar, Flaviar. Just go to the Solitaire Rose podcast website at crazycomics.solitairerose.com, where we're inviting you to join. It's a discovery service for spirits aficionados. You gain access to fine spirits at members-only prices. And if you use our link, you get a $10 credit when you join. Finally, if you're listening to this podcast, you are a good-looking person. And as a good-looking person, you cannot trust your skin to just any old razor. That's why we invite you to shave with the amazing razors from Dollar Shave Club. Every month, they send a box with your shave options. At the beginning of the week, you pop in a fresh blade, get that fresh blade shave. It feels fantastic. It's just one of the many ways that I maintain my good looks, and you can maintain your good looks. So join us at the Dollar Shave Club. Their plans start at $3 a month, and they have a money-back guarantee. So if you want to join, just go to www.dollarshaveclub.com/crazy. We love feedback. So if you'd like to give us feedback, you can send us an email at cory.strode@gmail.com, or you can call our voice line at 952-856-0519. Send us an email, drop us a message. We'll put you on the air. We'll answer your question. We love to interact with our fans. We've also got Facebook pages for the Solitaire Rose podcast, for the Crazy Comics and Stories podcast, and the upcoming Solitaire Rose novelcast. So go to Facebook, be our friend. We love friends. If you would like to advertise on Crazy Comics and Stories, Solitaire Rose Radio, or the upcoming Solitaire Rose novelcast, you can. Just send an email to cory.strode@gmail.com, subject advertising. Thanks. If you have any feedback, please let me know. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, please let me know. If you're a comic creator and you'd like an interview, go ahead, email me at cory.strode@gmail.com. I am going to be going back and interviewing some people I've already interviewed before because they have new projects coming out. But like I did with Patrick McAvoy, they're not going to be just standard interviews. We're going to talk about other things. So look forward to that. And one of the things I want to do is I want to do more episodes where I take a Jack Kirby story and break it down with someone to kind of do a DVD commentary. Another thing that's coming soon, Marvel and DC both did small run series in the 70s and 80s. Books that weren't successful but really kind of resonated, that only lasted, anywhere between 6 and 20 issues. I'm going to be doing some histories of those. If you have other ideas, other suggestions, pieces of comic book history you'd like me to talk about, please email me at cory.strode@gmail.com. And I'll be back soon with more stories.